Following in his father's footsteps, George Walker Bush Jr. became the 43rd President of the United States in 2001. Born in Connecticut on July 6, 1946, George Bush Jr. was the eldest son of the 41st President of the United States of America, George Bush Sr. Graduating from both Yale and Harvard with degrees in history and business administration, President Bush had an extensive business and political background prior to the White House. In his earlier years, he was known for being a partier, alcoholic, and a typical spoon-fed baby. After going back to college in the 70s, Bush became a functioning businessman. He even started his own exploratory oil company called Abstergo Energy. A few years later, he also bought the Major League Baseball team, the Texas Rangers. He later went on to become the two-term Texas governor before making his run for presidency in 2000.
From 2001 to 2009, the United States had many big issues with terrorism, starting only 7 months after George Bush Jr. became president. It was a very dangerous and overwhelming time, triggered by the events of 9/11. The new president was placed in a situation where he had to show the strength of America as well as our unwillingness to let the people responsible go unpunished. He showed this on September 20th during his State of the Union speech, where he declared war on terrorism. Based upon his initial response, President Bush's approval rating hit an all-time high of 90%. After passing a Patriot Act in October of 2001, and then creating an anti-American connection between Iran, Iraq, and North Korea in 2002, President Bush declared war on Iraq because their alleged weapons of mass destruction possession, and because Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, might have had connections with the terrorists responsible for 9/11. The decision to get involved with Iraq was highly debated and still is, even to this day. On April 9th, 2003, only hours after U.S. and Allied forces invaded Baghdad, Saddam Hussein's position fell, and Baghdad was placed under American control. In response to this win, President Bush gave a victory speech known as Mission Accomplished, during which he stated that the Battle of Iraq had been won. Due to reasons we will later address, this speech did not go over well at all. Now let's take a closer look at the speech we mentioned before. President George Bush reached the USS Abraham in Navy One, a fighter jet carrying him and his pilot. This is where we saw a good example of the president's rhetoric. Arriving in Navy One gave the president a feeling of empowerment. He was making an extravagant statement of togetherness, as if he was to say that he too was fighting the war. He arrived in a jumpsuit and walked off in an overflow of confidence. He put on his suit that was waiting for him on the ship and was escorted to the podium. The subject of the beginning of his speech was to show his gratitude for the men and women who put their life on the line.
Thank you all very much. Admiral Kelly, Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world. Our nation and our coalition are proud of this accomplishment. Yet it is you, the members of the United States military, who achieved it. Your courage, your willingness to face danger for your country and for each other made this day possible.
There are many things to notice about this brief speech. The first thing to point out is his timing. He spends more time approaching the podium and getting ready for his speech than he actually spends delivering it. He speaks slowly, using very common terminology. The speech comes off as being quite rehearsed. The big difference in President George Bush's speaking abilities comes from how rehearsed his speeches are. If you were to watch a small segment of him answering a question off the cuff, it's dramatically different from this speech we just listened to. It clearly was short and simple, whereas when he tries to go unscripted, you can really tell his poor speaking abilities. The next audio you will hear demonstrates this key difference.
Stretch. Big stretch. I'm sorry.
Mr. President. I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, it's time for politics. And, it's an absurd insinuation.
In that case, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
You could really see the difference between his scripted and his unscripted voice. He's naturally very stutterish and doesn't really get his point across too strong. But when he has a script, he's passable as an okay speaker. Now let's move back to the mission accomplished speech. Rehearsed. The controversy that came from this speech wasn't about his actual words, because they were quite generic, but it was about the banner in the background. This banner became a symbol of war, of this particular war. It showed the lack of recognition that rebuilding and making peace in Iraq would be a lot harder than just removing the dictator, which only took a mere hours. When you hear his speech, it does come off as quite generic. There's nothing that really backs up his grand entrance. He said exactly what his audience wanted to hear, and did not go into detail about how hard the next steps would be. We all know that they turned out to be quite difficult. The next steps proved to have more casualties and proved to take a lot more time. Looking back on this, him putting the label "Mission Accomplished" up behind him while he spoke was insulting, because our mission in Iraq was far from finished. It was far from complete. It was far from accomplished. This speech and this act showed us how much influence a simple banner can have. Just by the president standing in front of this and speaking a very generic kind of speech, it changed everything for him. His approval rating dropped. Where he stood and what he said had so much power during this time, even more so than he could realize.